Creo que sí, pero dice Miguel que tengo que esperar. ¿Yo les hago así? Liz, hola amigos, lo del video. Hello, everybody. Very nice to see so many people. Thank you very much for joining this debate. Before we begin, we have some announcements from the ATBCD committee. Please.
Hello, everyone. We did make this announcement right at the beginning of the conference, but we wanted to reintroduce ourselves, especially since we have a couple new people who have arrived. We are the DEI committee, and we are here to provide safety and any concerns that you all have. You are welcome to come to us with any of it. We're here to listen to you all. To introduce myself again, my name is Sumita. This is
Farah.
We have
Bea, hi.
We also have
Me. I'm Benita.
and
Flavia.
yes. So once again, we are here to listen to you all, to make sure that this conference is a safe place, is a happy place. And yeah, thank you all.
Thank you very much. There is another announcement for your safety. There is an ambulance outside in the Recinto Ferial. So if there is somebody that feel sick or needs some help, please go to the medical team or to the reception. And now I have the pleasure and excitement of introducing this debate about the effects of habitat fragmentation. This debate will be moderated by Juan Manuel Dupuy. Juan Manuel holds a PhD in ecology from the University of Connecticut, and now is a senior researcher at the Scientific Center of Yucatan. He's a plant ecologist focused on tropical structures and resilience in different landscapes. Thank you very much and enjoy the season.
Thank you very much, Victor, for the invitation to be moderator to this debate. I'm not an expert in this aspect, this theme, so I hope that I can be more impartial. I don't know if that was part of the reason I was invited, but thanks anyway. So I'm going to introduce the schedule of the debate, so the general structure of the debate. And I'm going to start up with some introductory remarks. So we all know that the rapid growth of human activities in the tropics has promoted loss and fragmentation. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, so yes, this is the structure of the debate. So I'm going to do the welcoming and the overview, and then questions to the audience. Then there's going to be the debaters' presentations. Each one will have 10 minutes to respond to some detonator questions. Then there will be discussion rounds and rebuttals from additional questions that I will pose to them, and that would be followed by questions from the audience. So you're all welcome to pose any questions to the panelists. And then there'll be time for conclusion. Each debater will have 5 minutes for concluding remarks. And then that will be I will make like a summary of the debate at the end. So we all know that the rapid growth of human activities in the tropics has promoted loss and fragmentation of tropical forests worldwide. And this graph was presented to you this morning by Maria Uriarte. And as you can see, last year was a record year of forest loss, mainly due to fires, mainly in the Amazon, but also worldwide. And we are losing 3 to 6 million hectares per year. That is equivalent to 8,000 to 16,000 hectares per day. That is really terrible. And there are compound disturbances, as we listened this morning. Now, what this means is that the remaining forests are being increasingly fragmented. So you can see here in these graphs, the one at the upper panel, you can see the frequency of different size fragments. And you can see that most of them are very small. And you can see the huge number of fragments here in the red box in the different continents. And also the mean or median size of the fragments is rather small. There are many of them, and they account for a substantial part of the forest, a substantial area of the forest. So this has sparkled a debate about the effects that this might have. And there are two sides of the debate. So there is consensus about the effects of habitat loss. It's bad for biodiversity, it harms biodiversity. But as for debates of fragmentation, there is a strong debate that started in the 1970s. And there are two sides. Some of them suggest that fragmentation effects cannot be isolated, separated from, habitat loss cannot be separated from fragmentation, and their effects are generally bad and strong. And the other side considers that there is a use and a need to separate those effects, that we can learn a lot by separating the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation by itself or per se. And that the effects, when we do that, the effects of fragmentation per se are not necessarily bad. They are usually weak, and when they are significant, they are positive. So tonight we're going to debate about this, but this is all sparkled by this species area relationship is part of the debate. So there is general consensus that the conservation value increases with area because larger area can support larger biodiversity. But when it comes to looking at the effects of fragmentation, there are these two different sides. So there's been a lot of papers that came out supporting the view that habitat fragmentation harms biodiversity, but there's also been papers dating from way back in the 70s, sorry, about that fragmentation is not always bad for biodiversity. So this has sparkled this debate, and to make things a little more clear, all this started with Jared Diamond's paper that proposed some strategies for conservation. And you see on the left panel, better practices, on the right panel, worse practices. And the first one is the one that I already presented. It's better to have larger fragments than smaller ones. The second one is the one that started the debate, whether it is better to have a single large fragment or several small ones. That is what started this debate. Because then what we are getting at is, so if we are able to standardize the area that has been lost, whether having one single patch or several different smaller patches, whether that has that is good or bad for biodiversity. So that is the title behind this debate. So with that introduction, I would like to pose a question to you guys, and we're going to use the same device that was used yesterday. So if you can please screen that in your cell phones, there'll be a question for you. It's a multiple choice question. Please post your answers. Oh, I need to do something here? Okay. Oh, okay. So that was the question. Which statement do you think is correct? Fragmentation effects are generally strong and negative. They are generally weak and positive. They cannot be generalized, or don't know. And it seems that fragmentation effects cannot be generalized is winning so far, followed by they're generally strong and negative. Okay. So now we're going to move to the detonator questions to the panelists. But I'm going to introduce the panelists before that. So I have the pleasure to introduce to you Christina Banks-Leite. She's an associate professor in the Department of Life Sciences in the Imperial College of London in the United Kingdom. She has published multiple papers on the effects of habitat amount and fragmentation on biodiversity and co-authored multiple high-impact papers on the relative importance of habitat loss and fragmentation. She is the winner of multiple awards. She has featured as one of the 15 most influential female researchers in the UK. And she has served as board member of the British Ecological Society and the International Association for Ecology. She is also in editorial boards of 3 international journals, and she is currently the academic lead of the gender equality in the Department of Life Sciences, having coordinated the successful submission of the Athena Swan Silver Award. So in this debate, she will argue that fragmentation threatens biodiversity, particularly in the tropics, and these processes and patterns cannot be separated from those of habitat loss. So please give an applause to Cristina. Thanks. And we also have, I have the pleasure to introduce to you also Federico Riva. He is assistant professor at the Institute of Environmental Studies at VU in Amsterdam. He specializes in spatial analysis and biodiversity science to address questions at the intersection of landscape ecology, biogeography, and macroecology. His research has been recognized with several awards and fellowships. He led recent work on the conservation potential of small habitat patches that has received widespread attention, including 2 highly cited papers in conservation letters and in ecology letters. In this debate, Federico will elaborate on how misconceptions about the value of fragmented habitat could compromise global conservation initiatives. So please give a big applause to Federico. So the detonator questions that I will ask each of the panelists to answer in their presentations are three. The first one is, what is habitat fragmentation and how does it affect biodiversity? The second one is, what are the main causes and issues of the fragmentation debate? And the third one is, how can fragmentation research contribute to tropical sustainability? So with that, I'm going to give the floor to the panelists, and they previously agreed that Federico will go first, and then it will be Cristina. So please, Federico.
One, the pointer.
Sorry.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juan, for the introduction. I also want to thank the organizer. This is an amazing opportunity. Ooh, can you hear me? Great. This is very humbling. I'm very happy to be here. It's a fantastic conference, and I'm excited about this talking about this very important topic. And I think if you want to answer this question, the first question being, what is habitat fragmentation and how does it affect biodiversity? We really need to lay down some assumption about how we think about this. And in this slide, I have three assumptions that I think it's important that we all agree on. And the first one is that if we use a word, in this case fragmentation, we should all agree on a specific meaning, because otherwise we're not debating about an ecological process, but we are debating about words, and that's not productive. And the second one is that if we feel compelled to use the word fragmentation, I think this has to be different from habitat loss. We know very well that habitat loss is negative for biodiversity, and so if we are detecting effects of habitat loss, we should not talk about habitat fragmentation because that generates confusion in the literature. And finally, because there are two main dimensions which habitat exists across landscape, which are amount of habitat and configuration of habitat, I think fragmentation should be dedicated to capture these effects of habitat configurations. And so you can see here on the figure on the right side that it's possible to examine landscape varying the degree of habitat loss and fragmentation. For instance, one could have 100 hectares of forest existing contiguous or 4 25-hectare patches. And so those landscapes have the same total habitat area, but they're different in terms of their configuration. And to make this a bit more explicit, if you imagine a forested landscape having 100% forest cover, we can think about the same habitat loss generating different patterns of remaining habitat. And so we could have 50% of the habitat being lost in a particular pattern that doesn't create fragmentation. We're just reducing the size of a patch. But we can also think about patterns that generate landscape mosaics where habitat exists fragmented. And so the idea here is that to understand fragmentation, we cannot focus on single patches, but we need to understand these landscape scale processes. And the elephant in the room for conservation biologists, then it's if understanding these patterns is useful for conservation, and I do believe it is, then we need to find a way to synthesize evidence and to move forward in this debate in a more constructive way. And this is particularly important because a lot of landscape exists globally at different degrees of fragmentation and area. So on the left side is the expectation that many ecologists have that habitat fragmentation and habitat loss are highly correlated. So if you imagine a landscape having many patches, people expect those landscapes to have little remaining habitat. On the right side, however, we analyze global patterns in forest amount, and you can see that on the x-axis, as we get different proportion of forest cover in this landscape, you can have anything between 10 patches or 1,000 patches. And in fact, about half of the forested landscape globally have more than 400 forest patches in this particular analysis. So clearly, it is important to understand whether having 70% of forest cover in a landscape but 1,000 patches is useful or not for biodiversity, because a lot of these places still harbor a lot of species. And understanding whether these small patches can be useful for conservation will allow us to reach this area-based target that we are currently facing. And in terms of the effects of habitat fragmentation, if we do consider it as these effects of configuration independent from habitat area, so far there has been little evidence that those effects are particularly negative. A lot of inferences about fragmentation are confounding the effect of habitat loss with the configuration of habitat. But we do know that the more habitat, the more species we have. And so there is no discussion about the negative effect of habitat loss. Really, what is the problem is understanding whether having landscape with aggregated or broken habitat can be useful for conservation. And just to give you an idea of the importance of habitat area in comparison to habitat fragmentation, on that plot there is a species area relationship, so logarithm of area of habitat in a landscape and logarithm of number of species on the y-axis. You can see there is a very clear positive effect of habitat area. The three little lines in red, black, and blue are the effect of fragmentation. So really, the effect of habitat loss when they're not controlled for will affect your inference in a way that suggests habitat fragmentation is negative. So it's really important that we separate them. So what are the main causes of the fragmentation debate? I selected two causes. I think there are many, but I think the two ones that I will present are the most important one. One is a low-hanging fruit in terms of problem that can be solved, and it's converging on a language that is more appropriate or like more clear. We reviewed the literature, and we found that the 25 most cited paper use 5 different definitions of habitat fragmentation. Some are very common, like the idea that reduced patch area is comparable to fragmentation is one. The second one compares landscapes that have lost habitat, and as a result have also more fragmented habitat. Whereas the third one is what I'm trying to discuss today, which is this idea that landscape with the same total habitat area can have different configurations. And the challenge here is that different people are discussing the same word, meaning different ecological processes. And this is clear when we think about titles of papers, for instance. So those are 3 randomly selected titles from Google Scholar where people talk about habitat fragmentation. And I just want to highlight how these authors are definitely thinking about different processes. So for instance, the first author are talking about the effect of habitat fragmentation and patch size, meaning that patch size is not a measure of habitat fragmentation. But we've seen before that one of the definitions that people commonly use is patch size. And the second authors are talking about habitat fragmentation and isolation, meaning that the two are different. But in metapopulation theory, we know that habitat fragmentation is defined as isolation and patch area. And finally, we have edge effects at habitat fragmentation, and many authors consider edge effects to be a measure of fragmentation. So the first step that we can do in order to solve this debate is really moving forward and try to agree on a language or defining ways to synthesize the literature that so far has not happened. And why is this confusion so important? Because we have all these definitions, and many of these definitions are correlated with habitat loss, there is this perception of fragmentation being highly negative. So we have seen this figure from Jared Diamond in 1975, suggesting that it's always better to have more habitat. And this is great. This is species area relationship. It's very well understood. But because we're measuring fragmentation in ways that confound habitat area with configuration, this generated a negative perception of the phenomenon of habitat being scattered. And so we analyzed the citation rate of 275 papers published in the past few years, and you can see that the more negative a paper is, the more cited it's going to be. So as ecologists, we have this very strong aversion for the term fragmentation. However, nobody disagrees that there is a difference between considering larger versus small patches or aggregated versus disaggregated habitat. And what we know is that when we review the studies that control for habitat area, there is not this very strong negative effect. And so ultimately, what is generating is that there is an underestimation of the value of fragmented landscapes because we are confounding the negative effect of losing habitat with the potential negative effect of existing disaggregated. And this also is hindering our capacity to understand the mechanisms that are affecting biodiversity, because we know that the effects of habitat loss are very strong. So really what we need to understand is the potential of this remaining landscape where a lot of scattered habitat exists. And finally, if we don't understand all these, the value of these small fragments, we are going to poorly allocate our resources. The second problem with the literature, which I think is much more subtle and difficult to tackle, is that we are missing data at the spatial extent at which habitat fragmentation should be studied. So we are limiting our capacity of collecting data, and because of that, we are forced to extrapolate from like smaller spatial extent to larger scale, where we can measure fragmentation. This is a very nice paper by Nick Haddad and colleagues, where it's the most cited review about habitat fragmentation in the past 10 years. And you can see that their argument is about the effect of reduced patch area or variable that you're measuring within patches. So the idea is that because you're studying a single patch, you can extrapolate it to a landscape containing multiple patches. However, this extrapolation might or might not work. And there are some studies, including some of my work or the work of Professor Ferrick, that shows that this doesn't always happen. So if you're thinking about edge effects, for instance, one could expect that a species that is sensitive to edge effects in a patch should be more common in a landscape that is fragmented, and vice versa, species that avoid in edges should be more common in a landscape that is more aggregated. And so you can see here on the left side, there is responses to fragmentation, positive and negative, and responses to edging on the x-axis. And so we should expect that pattern if it was possible to extrapolate to the landscape scale from patch inferences. However, when we look at the evidence, there is a much more complicated picture in that some species respond negatively to edges, but are more common in fragmented landscapes and vice versa. So this is just an example of these challenges about upscaling biodiversity variables, because sometimes these mechanisms are very complex and they're hard to interpret at the local scale. And finally, how can fragmentation research contribute to tropical sustainability? Admittedly, I'm not an expert of tropical ecology, even though I analyze this tropical data, but clearly fragmentation is a very important topic for the tropics, not only for global forests. This is a map showing 100,000 landscape measured in terms of their amount of forest and their fragmentation. And you can see in the tropic that everything that is pink means more than 400 patches of forest. So there are many landscapes across the tropics that contain large number of forest patches in smaller sizes. And if we don't understand how to manage and protect this landscape, we're not going to be able to sustain biodiversity in those regions where human activities have been already the most widespread. So this is a really important topic to which I hope the community will continue to contribute. And based on our research, I would say that our priorities for managing this landscape should not really be selecting between small fragment or larger fragment, should be avoiding habitat loss at all costs and managing the metrics in a way that enhances ecological processes, including connectivity and heterogeneity. And I want to say that right now we analyze the probability of losing habitat in different patches globally in a paper in 2022, and we found that the highest probability of losing habitat occurs in small patches globally. So clearly there is this dissonance between evidence that these small patches are important for conservation and our tendency of losing them because of human activities. Thank you.
Yeah, please, now it's your turn, Christina.
Yep. Thank you. Let's see how this works. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It is an honor, a pleasure. It's slightly terrifying, but I'm sure it'll be fine. It is also difficult to fit such big shoes and talk about a topic that is so complex, and that I'm sure that whatever I'll say, there will be lots of other angles that can be added to. My talk is going to be a little bit different to Federico's, who was very much on schedule with the detonated questions. So mine is going to be a bit of a roundabout, but I'll try to come back to those questions at the end. And first, I need to give a little bit of context about myself. So I've somehow have been on both sides of this discussion. So I've been on papers showing support for the habitat amount hypothesis. I've been on papers saying that fragmentation is really bad. And I've been on a really good paper with Federico where we've come together to try to find a halfway through to this. But my role today here is to defend that fragmentation is actually bad for biodiversity. And I'd say this is not a position that it's difficult for me to be in. This is what I truly believe in my core, and I think this is partially because of my personal experience of my formative years as a master's student, as a PhD student, doing field work in the Amazon and in the Atlantic forest, which are rainforests that work in a very, very different way to dry tropical forests of Mexico or forests of temperate forests of Canada. So their functioning is very different. But also because I've been working for so long on edge effects, I've done more work on edge effects than anyone here would care to know. So and that really shaped my view of it. So edge effects is one of the mechanisms through which we see the effects of habitat fragmentation playing out on biodiversity. And what I'm going to argue today is that fragmentation is bad for biodiversity because it basically changes habitat quality, and it changes habitat quality for everyone, for plants, for insects, for vertebrates, for everything. So tropical forests, just basic kind of overview of it, they're dark. They're really, really dark, these rainforests. And if you try to take a photo of them, it's going to come out blurred. And only 1 to 3% of sunlight reaches the forest floor. And that is a very important fact, because when suddenly you have open area and you have like a tree fall gap, then sorry, I'm making a little bit of noise here, but I have to move my hands. Too Brazilian to not move my hands. So what happens is that there's all this growth immediately coming through, and it's complete chaos. And oh, I see what's the problem. There's complete chaos, but very soon after, that forest will close back again, and the tree fallback will close. So in a way, that's kind of what you would hope that would happen with forest edges, but it's very far from that, and for two main reasons. So forest edges are far larger than any tree fall gap has, most tree fall gaps have ever been, and also the pastures or whatever the open areas, they're there to stay. They're not an ephemeral kind of habitat that will soon close. And again, if you're in the tropics and you're walking in that pasture there, you can feel the heat. It's kind of coming down on you, and it's really hot and it's horrendous. And then suddenly you get into the forest and you immediately feel the difference in the temperature. It's going to be cooler in the moment that you step into the forest. And if you happen to continue to move inside the forest core, you're going to find that the temperature is going to go even lower. And this is something that we showed in this paper here, where we looked at the buffering ability of forests and how that changed with respect to distance to edge. And what we found was that so the way to interpret this graph is that if you have a one-to-one relationship, so basically the temperature outside the forest is the same as the temperature inside the forest, then it's going to be close to 1. So that's kind of like there's no buffering, and that's the value. So higher values means no buffering, lower values means higher buffering, means that the temperatures changes are detrended between forest and outside the forest. And what you can see is that up until 20 meters into the forest, there's not a huge amount of change, so the forest is able to do this buffering, but then when you get really close to the edge, so that those 20 meters from the forest edge, then the forest is no longer able to buffer the temperature. So the temperature is going to be a lot hotter. And it's also going to be a lot drier, and it's also going to be a lot windier as well. So and because of that, there's all sorts of other issues that happen at forest edges. So those open areas don't maintain themselves open, by chance. Something's got to keep them open. So what keeps them open is usually fire. It's cattle, invasive species, what have you. Whatever it is, whatever is outside that forest is going to be going into the forest. So forest fires sometimes don't go all the way into the forest core, especially if it's a really wet forest, but they will burn the forest edges. And cattle will go into forest edges, and so will invasive species. And as Mario Diarte was saying this morning, there is, once a forest is burnt, then it's more likely to burn again. So all of these sorts of issues will affect edges a lot more than they affect, the interior of the forest. And because of that, basically the habitat in an edge, in a forest edge, is almost it's not comparable to an inside the forest. So here on the left, you have a typical edge, which is, just this complete mess. It's almost impenetrable. It's lots of pioneer trees and pioneer species, and lots of lianas, invasive species. And it's just a really different habitat to the habitat on the right, where you can see the forest floor, where species can, you can, where it is just a lot more open. And it's interesting that these differences were also seen sorry, I don't know how to say PDBFF in English, PDBFF, but I know it's not that. But you know what I mean, like the big experiment in Central Amazon. So that was an experiment where they saw those changes going through time. And despite the fact that habitat loss there wasn't actually that large, because you still had, a very large amount of forests around, they tracked all these changes in tree mortality at the edges, particularly of large cedar trees, and lower recruitment of those species, and the increase in pioneer species, such that there was what some call a secondarization of habitat of forest edges. This is not just with plants, so the same thing happens with vertebrates. So in this paper we analyzed data from across the world, so this is one of those global analyses where we measured the sensitivity to edge from different species. So again, the way to interpret this graph is that the higher the value, so the graph on the right is that values close to 1 means that the species has a very, very strong sensitivity to edge, whether it's positive or negative. And what you can see is that on average, species have high, across all taxa, there is a high sensitivity to edge effect. But when you look at the graph on the left, you can see that some species are positively affected, some species are negatively affected, which is kind of something that Federico was saying before as well. So for mammals and amphibians, for instance, those darker colors means those are the species that are forest core species, so they do not go anywhere near the edge. And you can see that mammals and amphibians, there are more species that do not go near the edge. While the intermediate colors, which is forest edge, so these are the species that prefer to be near the edge, they are even more common in reptiles and birds. So as you can see, there is kind of like this shift, and some species prefer something, and some other species prefer to be far away from the edge, and because of this kind of massive reshuffle in forest edges, basically, you've got completely different communities. What happens is that the dynamics are completely different as well. So in this paper, in this paper, we did like a exclusion of vertebrates at edges and at interiors, and we followed for a whole year to see how that affected arthropods and how that led to an impact in herbivory. And what we found is that if you exclude vertebrates at the interior of a forest, then you see the expected, increase in arthropods, and then also that leads to an increase in leaf damage. But if you do that same exclusion experiment at the edge, that we don't find that effect. Basically, this trophic cascade does not happen at edges. And we've also reproduced this same experiment in Malaysia and in the UK, and we found exactly the same results. And the way that we believe that what's happening there is that because insectivorous birds are already at low abundances at edges, they are already functionally absent. So if you exclude them, it doesn't make any difference. And what we found as well is that the predaceous arthropods are the top predators in these habitats. So basically you have this change in the dynamics of the system at edges. So what all this means is that, you could be saying, okay, so, some species will win, some species will lose. That's tough. The thing is, there's a lot of edges already, isn't it? Everywhere. So the forests are already really fragmented, and you just cannot reduce habitat, which we've seen because Juan has shown in that graph that there was a lot of deforestation. You cannot do that without also creating edges. So those edges are already benefiting all of these species that are benefited by edges. What we need is to invest in protecting the species that cannot live in edges, the species that need to be inside the forests. So the conservation value of these different species is completely different. And one of the things that we found in that paper with Marion Pfeiffer was that a lot of these species that are benefited by edges are usually invasive species. So, so this is all to say that how does this come all together to this discussion on habitat fragmentation? So I see edge effects as one of the main drivers of the impact of habitat fragmentation on species. And this is something that the problem with the edge effects is that as well is that they come from all sides of a patch. So for instance, if you have a round patch like that, you're going to have edge effects coming from north and south. And what happens is that they multiply each other. They have like an interactive effect. So when you have a large patch, you're going to have your nice boundary, your boundary with edge effects there, which you can't get away from that. But the closer you move towards the center, then you might actually have a true core, an area that it's not affected by edges. But the more you fragment this system, the smaller these patches are, even if you maintain the amount of habitat, then all of this area is going to be just entirely edge effects. So you can't separate these two things. And one of the things that I find as well that it's, that I think it's important to highlight is that these are, again, patterns that all of these longitudinal studies that have, fragmented habitats over time and then looked at how they change, they see those changes happening from, at the local scale. So I don't think that, although I agree that we have to have a common language, I think that the local scale is just as important, and we can't ignore that. So in my, to wrap up, I think that one of the biggest issues with all of this kind of fragmentation is that this is what's leading the biotic homogenization that we see, to the point that some people are now calling this to be called the homogecene, whether you like it or not. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so we are moving forward now with the structure of this debate, and I'm going to follow up with some personal questions to each of the panelists. And I'm going to ask you guys to please answer them in just 3 minutes. So the first question, I will ask it to Federico to give Cristina a chance to recuperate. Do you have any insights on the other panelists' position?
Yes, thank you. No, I think it's very important to stress that we agree on much more than we disagree on, and I took some notes. Of course, habitat quality is very important, and of course, conservation value differs across species, even though there is a degree of subjectivity. And so that's really challenging for us as conservation biology, deciding how to weight those priorities. And I also think homogenization is a massive problem. And the way we are thinking about it now is in terms of regional species pool and local assemblages. And I think that's really something we need to look at a bit more in depth. Although one of the results we found is that in this fragmented landscape, beta diversity tends to be higher. And so in a way, this separation of habitat, either because those patches originally were in unique conditions or because of drift or because of exclusive competition, tend to have different community of species. So it's still kind of challenging to reconcile all these mechanisms locally. And I will agree with you that it's really important to have this understanding of the local scale. And I think what is important moving forward is that we try to reconcile these results that seem counterintuitive and not possible together in ways that actually are possible. And we show that in our paper in Ecology Letter, that the fact that smaller patches are depopulated across a landscape doesn't necessarily mean that taking them all together at larger spatial scales causes lower biodiversity, because we have these stochastic dynamics and these interesting, unpredictable assemblages in a way. So, yeah, there are many aspects that are important. Also, you talk about wildfire and how edge effects that are increasing susceptibility, but some of these processes that increase risk are also spreading more fast when habitat is contiguous. So there are these, it depends on spread of pathogens. So it's really complicated to tease apart these effects of continuities versus fragmentation. And yeah, I don't know how long I've been talking for, but
I think that's about it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So please, Christina, I'm going to ask you just the same question. Do you have any insights on the other panelists' position?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree on the need for the common language. I think that is one of the main issues within the field of landscape ecology and fragmentation, that we just, each person calls it a different way. And I think it's partially because the issue is more complex indeed than perhaps we like to think it is. So I think it is something that we need to move forward, and I think it's something that Lenore Fayerick did an incredible job, with the 2003 paper, to kind of try to bring everyone to that, so to the same language. Whether it worked fully or not, that's a different thing, but it was a very important attempt. I think what I would say is that there is a difference between space for time substitution studies and longitudinal studies. So, for instance, the results that you show that you can get loss without fragmentation and vice versa. Can't remember, it was a graph, yeah. That is something that, if you look throughout the world and you just choose the different landscapes, I'm sure that you can get that. But when you look at a satellite image of, a forest, a road being created in the Amazon, and that starts being, becomes the fishbone pattern, and then if you see through time, you do not separate the two things. They are always together. So while you can do it on a space for time substitution, you can't do it through time. So that's why I think so much of the discussion is based on how do we even define it? Is fragmentation a temporal process, or is it a spatial process entirely? And I think perhaps that's some of the crux of the discussion. And again, when we look at these sorts of studies from long-term projects that, such as the Manaus project, where they had the before and after measuring through time, we see that all of those changes happen even despite not having a huge amount of loss. So I think it's, I think perhaps one of the problems that we have is not necessarily seeing each other's side of it regarding this temporal versus spatial process.
Thanks very much, Christina. And that set up the stage very nicely for the next question, which is doing an interesting flip to your positions. So I'm going to ask now Federico to defend how fragmentation can be bad for biodiversity.
Yes. Oh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody contends that there is impossible to have negative fragmentation's effect. There are certainly conditions in which habitat existing disaggregated will have undesirable effects for biodiversity conservation. And so there is a bit of a distinction between what we're finding in the data, which is why we raised this kind of point in the past few decades, particularly in North Ferrig, and the understanding that there will be situations where habitat existing disconnected will be suboptimal. And so, for instance, if you're thinking about contexts where the matrix is very hostile, so where mortality of species is very high, such as in island system, for instance, then one would expect fragmentation to have to be more likely to have negative effects. Or for species where behaviors or reproduction is density dependent, if you have these isolated patches, you can imagine that maybe flock behavior of animals, they have to have a certain number of birds in order to behave a certain way, and so a small fragments will not be able to sustain that type of behavior. Or you can think about the Lee effects. And yeah, also there is a very important scale component to it, because it's mind-bending, but one can envision scenarios where you're maximizing biodiversity in a landscape, but you're decreasing it at the global scale. Because maybe you have more generalist species in the smaller fragments, and the only dodo remaining is in the largest patch. And so you might maximize biodiversity in your landscape and cause a decline in biodiversity globally. So those are real situations that I think we need to collect the data to test more, because a lot of these inferences also about temporal dynamics are usually restricted to patches. And so there the challenge is understanding how much of those dynamics are deterministic or stochastic. If all the time you're going to lose these more sensitive species, and what is the chances of that? And there are also some other aspects of fragmentation that are very commonly expected but are not really supported by the data. We look at extinction death, particularly in our Ferex lab, and there was as much support. There was support for extinction death from habitat loss, but not from fragmentation. Connectivity is another one of these terms that have many forms, but in terms of connectivity, fragmental landscape are also not as bad. So it's complicated, but in general, there are definitely cases where fragmentation can be negative. And I think it's important that we found those cases so we can put boundaries into these configurations of habitat that can be useful.
Excellent. Thanks, Federico. So, Christina, same question for you. Please defend how fragmentation can be good for biodiversity.
Yeah, so it is a difficult topic, but because I've done a lot of this work, and even with my own data set, and when we measure fragmentation in the way that has been suggested, like you have to define it at the landscape level and you have to define it in the specific way. It is true that the effects of fragmentation on species are always much weaker than the effects of habitat loss. So, I mean, every single time I've done these analyses, that's what I find. But that's when I define it at the landscape scale in that very specific way. But I think what's it, again, it's kind of going towards what you were saying, Federico, that I think the effects are really variable across the world. So we also had a paper showing that edge effects are much stronger in certain parts of the world, and this led to the idea for us to test the extinction filter hypothesis, so that species are less sensitive to habitat fragmentation in areas where there is a lot of historical disturbances, such as fires, such as cyclones, such as glaciers, and so forth. And I think, and it's pretty clear that in areas such as Canada and Central America as well, the effects of edge effects were much weaker than in other areas, and probably positive as well. So I think these are things that, again, I can absolutely see how fragmentation can be seen as positive, because I think there is a kind of biogeographical aspect to it.
Yeah, okay. So the last question I'm going to put forward is, what have we learned from this debate, and how can we move forward? So I'm going to ask you first, Federico, please.
Yes. For me, it's been a process in the sense that I work on fragmentation for 10 years, and I started very much from island biogeography theory and models. And my biggest takeaway is that we need to confront models and theories with data, and we need to collect the right data to test theories that we're interested in. And oftentimes we don't have this capacity, and so we have these surrogates. So we're trying to use data collected by other scientists for other questions to address these particular topics. And I think if we really want to be serious about resolving this debate, we really get to collect the right data in the right way. For instance, longitudinal studies are really important. I think it's a big shortcoming we have. So in general, many colleagues come and tell me that their model doesn't match our data sets, and I always suggest go and collect some data and let's see. And if you're finding data that disproves what we found, fantastic. We have more information so that we can better protect these systems. And I think that's really something important that myself and colleagues, I hope, will realize more and more. And then more generally about this fragmentation debate, I think the challenges of spatial extrapolations, and this is something I'm becoming more and more interested in, how these, landscape are large entities. When you're thinking about 100 square kilometer, like the stochastic nature of a lot of these processes and how they replicate makes them very hard to predict. And so for me, really trying to figure out how to use these inferences locally to predict across this larger scale has been a very big challenge. And I think it's a frontier in ecology if there is some young ecologists that want to really work on that. And yeah, the language too. I think in ecology and in conservation, we get away with using words in a very relaxed way because they rarely are accumulated with a single definition. So we're thinking about complexity or resilience or biodiversity or fragmentation. And those are maybe having each of them 5 or 10 definitions. And so if we want to find ways to protect this system, we have to be able to synthesize these hundreds of studies that are coming out. And so all these being stubborn about fragmentation, for me, it's really an attempt to understand this very important topic that I think is still misunderstood in many ways.
Thank you. Now it's your turn, Cristina, please. So what have we learned and how can we move forward?
So I think that I'm going to talk about language, but in a slightly different way. So I'm going to tell you the story of how Federico and I met. So one day I was on Twitter and I had a couple of glasses of wine. Well, Twitter was Twitter, sorry. That was a long time ago. It was a long time ago now. So I had a couple of glasses of wine, and then I saw this colleague, Marian Pfeiffer, having a go at someone. Again, I had a couple of glasses of wine, and I was like, I'm going to go as well. And then it was, Federico, poor Federico. And then he reached out and said, I think you sent it as an email and said, look, I really respect the two of you. I really like your research. Can we please talk? And I was like, oh my God, like an actual interaction. I'm not so sure. And it was during pandemic, but we did actually meet and we went for a fish and chips in a pub in England. And it was really fascinating for me to, for the first time, understand his side. What was it that, what were the conservation implications that he was seeing from us saying that fragmentation is bad, and that was something that really showed a lot to me. And I think there is a lot of this discussion is it's done over rebuttals and papers that we write on each side, and a lot of the language can be quite harsh, partially because, as Federico says, the harsher the language, the more likely you are to get that paper out. So I think this has led to this divide rather than the actual interest in trying to understand the other side. And until this is reached, until this bridge is kind of, crossed, we're never going to kind of move forward with this debate. So I think that's my kind of 2 cents. But I would say also that I think what we need to figure out is in this kind of terminology is that what it seems to me is that there is a fundamental difference in how we think that these effects occur. So I think the fragmentation is bad side thinks much more bottom up. So the effects are local, and then they kind of extrapolate it to a landscape scale. And fragmentation is good side thinks that it's the other way around. It's more top down from the landscape to the local scale. So I am absolute certain that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and most of my work has shown that landscape scale effects are driven by macroecological effects anyway. So I'm sure there is all sorts of cross-scale inferences that we need to sort out before we can actually reach an agreement.
Thank you very much. Well, I think this is really exciting, and that reminds me of some of the plenary sessions that we have had here. So this problem about putting yourself into each other's shoes, I think it's very important. Communicating and being able to build these bridges, as we have seen in several presentations. I think that's a very important thing. And we have seen it before in terms of scientific community bridging out to other people, to society, to indigenous people, but also within the academia, within the scientific community. I think that is very important. So with that, I'm going to move to the next section of this debate, which is opening the floor to the audience to make any questions to the panelists. So please feel free to make any questions. We have one here, please. Another one over there.
Oof.
Well, let's start with this one here. Over here, please. Okay.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic debate. I have to say that being sort of systems researcher, I was convinced by every one of your interventions. Like I was playing a ping pong, an academic ping pong. I was, okay, when Federico presented, I was totally kind of opening up for fragmentation. And then when you spoke about being bad for everything, but then suddenly I got the notion of, I kind of got baffled by the absence of people. So I would like to pick up your minds on how sensitive are local communities to forest edges, and how good or bad is fragmentation for local communities. Thank you.
You want to go?
No. That's a very good question. So I think perhaps that is one of the reasons why I think fragmentation is so bad, because the more you open, so the more edges you have, the more likely that it is that some of the deleterious effects of what people are doing will go into the forest. So, for instance, if you have people hunting, they're more likely to reach inside the forest if it's divided in several different bits. Again, fire, it's more likely to reach the forest. There is also potentially a benefit for some people, if people can come into the forest and benefit by that. But I have never studied that, I'll be honest, but it is something that I think that human users are definitely going to kind of further reduce the amount of habitat and change the habitat quality because that forest is being burnt or whatever, used for whatever reasons.
Yeah, I mean, taking the other side of it, in many systems where habitat has been lost and there is not much nature left, maintaining this small fragment is also one of the few opportunities for people to be in reach of biodiversity and nature. And so especially in places like Europe where I work, it's really fundamental that those fragments are not left because we really want to avoid alienating people and their connection with nature. And in many places where there is intense pressure for habitat loss, those are already places with a lot of people, and what remains, it's really fundamental that it's not lost, not just for the ecological value, but also for the experience value of taking a walk in nature and seeing these animals and plants and butterflies. And so of course, it's a very complicated question also because of the potential benefits that these smaller patches might have, because usually they're nested into these working landscapes with agricultural fields, and so you have these spillover effects. So it's such a broad question, but yeah, it's depending on the priorities that you are ranking or thinking about, I think an argument can be made that fragmented landscape might be more positive, or contiguous habitat that exists aggregated is more positive. So, and also depending on the region of the planet for sure.
Thank you. So, yeah, we have a question here, another one there, please. I don't know if there are two microphones. Okay, so first, this side, then that side, and that one.
This is a very, very beautiful question. And Christina also already mentioned it as a biogeographic element. When I saw the pictures of the small circles and big circles, I immediately thought about the theory of MacArthur. And so he used equations made by Levens, and he has several parameters. There's one parameter for the surface, for the area. And there's another parameter for the amount of islands. So if you keep the surface constant, and if you switch the amount of area from 1, which is without degradation, to a bigger number, which is with degradation, fragmentation, what would happen? What would the equation predict?
I'm not sure I heard you very well because it's a little bit noisy here. So you're asking what would happen with the island biogeography theory prediction, or if we had lots of little islands.
I think MacArthur had the same question.
Yeah.
I can.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, so island biogeography theory doesn't account for turnover though. So island biogeography theory models or predicts species richness. And so the question is whether turnover across patches is deterministic or not. And this is what Simberloff and Abel in 1976 also argue against Diamond, that we are assuming when we think that fragmentation is necessarily bad, we're assuming that the species-area relationship always deterministically exclude the same species from their smaller fragments. But if there is some stochasticity and the species that accumulate are different across the small fragments, then what we have is that you can have more species across these fragments. And so this was shown mathematically in 1976 by Simberloff and Abel, but it's also been seen in experimental systems. So really, one of the main problems here with fragmentation is in which system patches are too small or too isolated to deterministically always filter the same sensitive species. Because that's really the problem there. And so island biogeography theory has been used a lot, and it's fantastic for conservation, but also doesn't really account for these beta diversity or turnover that underlies a lot of these positive fragmentation effects we documented in the data. Yeah,
I would say pretty much the same. That the issue is that because we can't measure changes in community composition, it's hard to, like, whatever the prediction is from, having lots of small islands of the same size, it's not necessarily relevant to habitat patches because it's a different time frame, and also because you have these changes in beta diversity and community composition. So I think in a way the island biogeography theory it's basically the only kind of mechanistic explanation that we have so far still for habitat loss or habitat change, but it's really not good enough because it doesn't really kind of touch onto all of these kind of changes in species composition that we see. And I think that is one of the main discussion points between the two sides, because we can't quite agree on how to measure also biodiversity.
Yeah.
Not sure if it answers, sorry.
Thank you. So we have a question from Jorge. Can you, okay.
Yeah, I'm Jorge Meave from UNAM. Thank you very much for the debate. I enjoyed it immensely. And the reason why I liked it so much, because this is an issue I've been thinking about for decades. Because when I was doing my PhD, I was working on forest fragments in Belize and their potential to contain a large amount of rainforest species. So this is not really new. I had to really dive into the sloth controversial, which at that time was really still very hot, although a little bit old. But I would like to ask you is that over all these years, decades already, I'm still missing some more biology in the debate. And because I really like Federico's view, I'm more prone to believe that we need this separation between fragmentation and habitat loss. Sometimes we imagine that forests are like pizzas, and we can cut pizzas, but when we slice them and we put them on different plates, the size of the pizza is still the same, but we cannot push pieces of forest apart so that we maintain the area the same and by increasing the fragmentation. But what I'm really thinking about is those, particularly in wet forests, those really big trees that grow at very low densities. And this is not really related to the edge effect, but I'm thinking more on the size of the populations that can be retained in the different patches. So I'm wondering to what extent there are some sort of size thresholds under which you are not more able to maintain a viable population. And depending also on the quality of the matrix separating the fragments, which is also something that hasn't been discussed in this debate, those populations are effectively separated or not. So I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit more on this issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really serious concern, and there will be species which exist in isolation and with small population size might experience a lee effects or population depression, extinction. The reason why we did our work is that this is not coming out in the data necessarily, either because those species are rare and have not been sampled, or because there is a sampling bias in places where scientists were looking for biodiversity. So it's really challenging to answer those questions and identify those cases. But really coming in a different angle to these, our research is not really pointing at the fact that smaller patches are great. It's pointing at the fact that after accounting for habitat loss, there is a lot of potential that can be untapped. And maybe for some species, we need to protect this larger fragment, but for some other species, very common, like some small bird or some butterflies, where population sizes can be sufficient in smaller fragments, then if you're losing those smaller fragments, you're losing those populations as well. So I think there has to be, we like to play this debate or to play this dichotomy, but really we are all very well aware that there is value in different habitat configuration for different taxa, but there is a very big unbalance in conservation policy and practice where larger patches are always considered to be this like very important thing to prioritize. But if I have $1 million and I can protect 10,000 hectares of habitat fragmented or 5,000 hectares of habitat existing contiguous, I don't know in which cases I would choose the contiguous habitat. So it really depends also on these matters of trade-offs and availability.
I just want to touch on the matrix issue. So absolutely the matrix matters a huge amount, and it's one of the defining factors as to whether fragmentation or even habitat loss is actually going to be bad or not. So in one study done by one of my PhD students, we found that patches surrounded by plantation of eucalyptus were far less, they didn't have real edge effects. There was no difference between edge and interior, while patches that were surrounded by pasture had very strong differences between the edge and interior. And this is something that has been shown also for connectivity and for effects of habitat loss as well. So the more permeable the matrix is, the more likely that really, species can use and transverse and all of that. But I couldn't agree more with you about the biology. I do think that is one of the pieces that the discussion that's missing, that there's a very big difference between the map and the actual thing in this. But I don't have a solution for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question there.
Hi, thank you very much. Emilio Bruna from the University of Florida. Hey, Chris. We haven't had a chance to meet yet, Federico, but I'm looking forward to it. I want to thank you both for this conversation and more broadly for the debate, which if you're willing to step away from the kind of hurt feelings that you might have if you're on one side or the other, I've personally found it incredibly useful in two particular ways. One, the importance of clarity in terminology. it's nice to be reminded of that once in a while. We do get sloppy. The second thing is the emphasis on landscape scale processes versus patch level processes, and writing our papers and drawing conclusions about one of those. But in light of that, I'd like to follow up with a question for you, maybe not as nice and polite as some of the other ones, which is that there's an expectation of clarity in the terminology that we're using, and yet in the debate, what you see is habitat fragmentation, and here is the clarity, the same amount of habitat, different spatial arrangement, good or bad for biodiversity, and biodiversity is itself an incredibly unclear, imprecise, messy term. And so the debate has on, is it good or bad for biodiversity? But what it's really been about in the literature primarily, with caveats, is species-rich diversity, beta diversity, and not interspecific interactions, population growth rate, ecosystem processes, nutrient fluxes, photosynthesis. And so I'm wondering if you could point to, well, I'm not sure, I want to ask if you agree with me or not, I don't care. Instead, what I'll ask, mainly because I may be wrong, but I'm wondering if you could tell us if you think most of the work that's been done on this debate has centered, in fact, on questions of species richness and diversity, and in fact, if there are lacuna in our knowledge that would inform this debate, should people go out and work on more precisely ecosystem processes or interspecific interactions, or is this loose definition of biodiversity good enough?
I agree. That's all I have to say.
Okay, then I'd like to hear whether you agree or not. One more time, please. No.
I agree with you, Emilio Bruna. So yeah, no, absolutely. I do think that part of the discussion is even, it's not necessarily even how we're measuring fragmentation, is what we're measuring on. And I absolutely agree that it is mostly been on species richness up until now. Personally, I have a bias that I think species richness is a very poor metric of biodiversity, and it sucks. It doesn't actually measure much. And other measures of diversity are also a little bit bad, but that's my bias. But yeah, I think, so for instance, studies showing that biomass of trees, or the forest is lower at the edge as well, and smaller patches and so forth. So I do think that perhaps that would be the best way forward, is to kind of set on a very clear response variable, very clear explanatory variable, and then test that. I fully agree.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Dr. Bruna.
You have to say I agree.
Yeah, no, I really wholeheartedly agree. No, I think it's a really big problem. I will take a slightly different take, starting from the fact that I agree. Well, usually species richness is quite correlated with other measures of phylogenetic or functional diversity. I think the abundance and the temporal component of it, so population and might be depressing, are very important, and that's not been studied well enough. We do have some work looking on phylogenetic and functional diversity, and it kind of mirrors species richness. I would say, though, that it's an indicator, and even though, like, if the same indicator can be used to suggest that the larger patches are good, and nobody is bothered by that, I think we should also be intellectually honest and understand that we can play with the same indicator and answer question the other way. And so it's really a matter of what are we trying to do with species richness? Because if you're thinking about maybe rare species, that's not the point, but there is a lot of policy suggesting that, the diamonds rule. It was mobilized by the IUCN, WWF, and the United Nations, and became basically a global principle for 50 years without really being validated, because 1 year after Diamond's paper, there was a rebuttal. And so really, there is a scientific aspect to it, which I completely agree, and then there is a policy and social aspect, which I think is a bit more tricky to navigate, because we are discounting some results with the same indicator and enhancing the other one. So it's...
Thank you very much. We have a question over there, please.
Juan, I think we have to.
Okay. That would be the last question.
Okay, so thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. My question is simple. Regarding, you spoke about finding a middle ground. So I wanted to know, what do you guys think of, how does the intensity and the speed at which fragmentation happens affect if the effects of this fragmentation could be good or bad? And is there some sort of middle ground where you can, I don't know, it makes me think a little bit about the intermediate disturbance theory, where biodiversity and whatever is increased. So do you guys think there's a middle ground where too few fragmentation is not good, too much fragmentation, it's not good, but if you have a certain amount of fragmentation at a certain speed, this gives the ecosystem and the landscape enough time to make new complexity and new interactions and conserve these ecological functions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important aspect of it, the spatial extent at which we're measuring habitat, and again, the metrics, the distance between patches, those are all aspects that affect the overall balance of this biodiversity in the landscape. So I think probably the relationship is U-shaped. If you have 100% habitat or 0% habitat, then you're going to lose the species of the other type. So there is always this kind of balance in between that, you know, as Cristina showed, there are some species that are positively responding to edges and negatively responding. So if you do have enough habitat of all the types, then you should be able to maintain both species pools. So there is something to that. And there is also these natural disturbance regimes that generate somehow this landscape mosaic. So we also have this notion that we need to maintain everything stable and let the cellular succession going forever, which maybe it's a bit outdated in terms of management, which doesn't justify losing habitat to create fragments, but I think gives support to these finding value in some of these early cellular successions and assemblages of species in smaller fragments, which we thought were not as valuable, maybe.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and that I hadn't really thought about. And I do think that there could be some level of acclimation. And Cynthia Cornelius, who might be here or not, has done some incredible work showing that individuals of the same species living in a fragmented area, they behave very differently to individuals in a continuous area, to the point that if they go out into kind of like into the matrix, they don't really know how to behave if they are from the control forest. It's absolutely incredible work. So there could be some level of slow level fragmentation that they could acclimate to, but I don't think this has been done at all. Maybe it's the sort of thing that you could do like in a lab with mites, but I don't know. Not with jaguars.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for all your questions. It's been really exciting. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask the panelists to please make your final remarks, each of you. So I'm going to give you now the floor first, Cristina, to make a little change.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's been really fascinating, and I think it's been really helpful, and it's been very important to kind of have this discussion. One of the things that you were saying about how the potential implications of saying that fragmentation is bad is that this could mean that small patches don't have any value, and therefore we can just cut them all down, which is not exactly what the fragmentation bad people is saying. But I think perhaps one of the bigger issues that we face, it's perhaps this lack of consistency in our response and explanatory variables, but also our gut reaction to what the other side is saying. It's kind of like what I interpret that to be the conservation implication of a paper that you may publish. So I think this is something that we need to bridge and perhaps become a little bit more detached and kind of really try to understand why is it that you're saying that? Why do you think that the world will be better if we follow that?
No, I agree. And I think these type of dialogues are fundamental if we want to bridge this distance between groups, because my experience is that most research groups are trying to solve a problem. And so it's much easier to solve a problem when you explain yourself and try to have a conversation. And I want to say thank you, Cristina, because this was a very insightful dialogue for me as well, and Juan as well for moderating. But yeah, there is a lot of research going on, and my hope is that this type of conversation will help in steering it in a way that is constructive. And yeah, I'm very open to criticism later if you want to come and talk. And Oh, and I wanted to say, because I didn't say it, I really want to thank all the collaborators with which I worked before, and particularly Federico, which is not here, but has been a very important source of inspiration for this research. And yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So now it's time to close the debate. I'm going to make a few points. As we have seen, there are two broad but opposing views on the effects of habitat fragmentation on biodiversity, and understanding whether fragmentation has positive, neutral, or negative effects on biodiversity is urgently needed to design biodiversity-friendly landscape scenarios. So we have seen here that there are important points of agreement. I would like to highlight some of them. The first one is pretty obvious. Deforestation, habitat loss is continuing at an alarming rate in the tropics and is a major driver of biodiversity loss. So this highlights the urgency to halt and reduce habitat loss as much and as quickly as possible. The second one is that deforestation and habitat loss generally entails or is accompanied by fragmentation. So in the real world is generally not very easy to separate, to tease apart their effects, the one of fragmentation or habitat loss, and that conservation efforts should focus on human-modified landscapes and to take into account landscape structure and composition, as well as local effects on habitat fragments. I would add to this also the need to standardize the language to make sure that everybody is speaking about the same thing, they understand the same thing from the terms that are using, and also from the intervention from Bruno, the need to make sure that the response variable also is being standardized, not just the so what the effect is, what you mean by fragmentation, but also what are you measuring it on. But there are also important controversial points that remain, and one of them is the validity and the usefulness of separating the effects of fragmentation per se from those of habitat loss, whether you can do it and whether you can gain insights from that. Also, the scale of the effect, we have seen emphasis on the remnant fragments, on the whole landscapes, or both, and I guess that the agreement is that it should be both, it should go both ways. And also the role of small fragments, we have seen that, you know, that was at the roots of the debate at the beginning. What is the value of small fragments for conservation? But I think that we are also getting some agreement there here, so I'm very pleased about that. And all of that leads into what are the most appropriate strategies to conserve biodiversity in human-modified landscapes. So resolving these controversial issues is imperative to inform conservation practitioners with simple and unified guidelines about how we can preserve biodiversity in fragmented tropical landscapes. And I hope that this debate has been as enriching to all of you guys and as it has to me. And I would like to thank first the panelists very much. Thank you, Cristina. And thank you, Federico. Please give them a big applause. I would also like to thank Victor for creating all this opportunity for this debate.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
I want to say you thank you and a small.
Oh, wow.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Oh,
Thank you, Victor.
thank you so much.
And I would also like to thank all of you guys who stood until the end, past the time, due to my poor job at keeping track of time. So thank you very much and for your enthusiastic participation. And now it's time to relax and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.
And the rest of the Congress.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Juan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Yeah.